part 2 of the High Priestess from the Holy Book of Thoth, Vladimir Shmakov, on the world passive principle. The great mother of all that exists, the divine Isis, is the second hypostasis of the first cause of the Absolute, the one universal spirit. It is inaccessible to man, but he can strive for it and know it as he approaches the transition of the triune deity to world creativity. This hypostasis pours out in our consciousness in the second member of the first divine turner, in the world eternal, the feminine principle, in the world passive principle, which carries out creativity together with the active principle. That which in ordinary language is understood by the word passivity, the absence of the ability to act independently, has nothing to do with the true nature of the passive principle and its cosmic meaning. In fact, passivity, like inertia, cannot exist in the divine world, in principle, for it is the domain of eternal life, the source of being, and being itself in its highest absolute development. Both the great principles, active and passive, are equally the sources of life, equally active to all phenomenal nature, and equally create and carry out world life. The difference between these principles is infinitely deeper and comes from their very essence, for they are noumenal aspects of the supreme reality. Noumenal. In the field of phenomenal nature, the passivity or activity of an action or factor refers only to the formal side of phenomena and expresses the relative position of a person in relation to the object of perception. By the activity of the subject, I mean the ability to act on the object at will or under the influence of a third higher factor. By passivity, I mean the ability to perceive from outside the world under the influence of one's own independent will or under the prompting of a higher factor. Each person, according to these definitions, generally speaking, has both of these abilities and becomes active or passive, depending on the specific circumstances. In relation to a substance on which nothing outside the underlying principle can influence, because it contains everything in itself, the above definitions of activity and passivity cannot be applied. Its activity and passivity are equally conditioned by the modes of self-consciousness. The universal active principle is the maximum, divinely perfect development of the principle of activity. It is the principle of the action of the deity as the supreme self-sufficient force outside of its absolutely synthetic unity, on its partial aspects, potentially contained in this unity. The universal passive principle is the maximum, divinely perfect development of passivity. It is the principle of the inner being of an absolutely synthetic unity, and the perception by the contemplation of its own emanation, brought out in the aspect of the active principle, and then reflected in its individual, potentially enclosed in this unity, aspects. In this interpretation of the active and passive principles, the latter approaches in our consciousness the concept of the divine pralaya, while the former is the basis of manifestation. During pralaya, the deity unites these two principles. During manifestation, he calls to life his active principle, and by the life of the universe, by the experience of the sparks emanated by him, the deity influences himself and therefore calls to life the passive principle. The perfect man reveals the active principle insofar as he influences the other beings of the universe, the passive principle insofar as he lives in himself. At the meeting of the two principles, the active principle encourages the passive principle to change the scope of its activity and to transfer the work previously directed to the depths of its being to the outside world. Now we have the beginnings of the theory of binaries, which readers of Meditation on the Tarot, of Meads, of Shmakov, of Nina Rudnikova, all of them will know is pretty much the work neutralising and resolving binaries, the work of the hermit. The concept of binary and its role in metaphysics. The Gospel does not say yes to one person or no to another, but yes and no to the same person. The Gospel rests on apparent contradictions, on antinomies, like a bird on its wings. Every human representation, image, thought, or idea is the result of the juxtaposition of certain other representations, images, thoughts, or ideas. Because of this, no factor of the universe in itself is incomprehensible, and the whole idea of it is composed of the relationships that it has with others, which are in harmony with it by nature, but differ in the degree of intensity and direction of qualities. Thus the Quran says, "We created all things in pairs." This means that in the nature of each being there are two opposite principles, light and darkness, cold and heat, good and evil, the active principle, male and passive, female. This brings us to 3 points. 1. The human mind is essentially capable of perceiving only the differences of phenomena, but not their actual essence. 2. Every complex representation is a complex of simple representations generated by oppositions. And 3. Two simple representations opposed to each other and thus mutually confirmed represent an elementary system. This basic form of mind is traditionally called binary, or according to Kant, antinomy. The above is stated and synthesized in 2 laws. Binary is a relative form of thinking in general, which stems from the properties of the human mind, but is for it the only, and therefore the absolute way of comprehending the diverse phenomena of the universe. The human mind comprehends and can comprehend the world only in binaries, which is for it only their general complex. 3 abilities are involved in the acquisition of knowledge. 1. The ability to distinguish. 2. The ability to find identities. And 3. The ability to preserve synthesis. That's from Ben. And as Sri Shankaracharya says, through discrimination, true knowledge is achieved. I'm just psyching myself up for this. A single representation is affirmed by a simple contraposition. A complex representation, as a set of individual representations, is affirmed by a set of a number of contrapositions. A single or complex representation is equally an immobile system. It expresses a certain thought or a separate law. That is, it takes place only in this case. An idea or law is distinguished from a concrete representation by the presence of an element of motion in it. Every idea, every law strives for development, for generalization, for synthesis, and the striving is always inextricably linked with their very expression, with their very transcription, no matter how accidentally this transcription is chosen. Thus the idea is in the same relation to the representation as the living being is to the immobile form. Although the idea can be expressed by a number of separate representations, but only with a certain approximation, with the implication of an internal connection between the forms in their successive series, that is, with the assumption, as it were, of the fluidity of these forms and the smooth transition from one to the other. The opposition is carried out by the introduction of the principle of the opposite. What is asserted is limited and confirmed by the negation of the opposite categories as such. In contrast, therefore, the whole attention of the human consciousness is directed exclusively to the thing asserted in comparison. The categories of the negated, by the negation of which the representation is affirmed, may not be united at all and may not be revealed in their totality. If the representation is singular, it is clear that such a juxtaposition is a binary. If it is complex, then the juxtaposition is confirmed by the totality of a number of concrete binaries. In this case, only those members of the individual binaries that are categories of the approved one are synthesized. The opposite terms may not be synthesized at all, and thus the statement of a complex concrete representation may be revealed in a hidden binary. That is, in other words, it is quite possible that the binary quality of this act will not reach the consciousness of the affirmer. In complete contrast to the above, when approving an idea, not only all single binaries must be identified, but also both binary syntheses must be approved. By the presence of the finite binary, the very existence of the ideas as such is confirmed. This is summed up by the law. Every idea must be revealed in the approved binary. Only in this case can it have vitality and a general character. In the opposite case, it turns into a concrete representation, into an immobile form. As Andrew Belli says, the knowledge of ideas reveals in temporary phenomena their timeless eternal meaning. This knowledge unites the understanding and the feeling into something different from both, covering them. That is why the knowledge of ideas we are dealing with intuitive knowledge. This is why in the knowledge of ideas we are dealing with intuitive knowledge. Every concrete representation, although it contains a priori the possibility of the synthesis of its elements, but, nonetheless, taken by itself in certain phenomenal facets, it is a system stationary in relation to the external environment. Its changes can only occur under the influence of a higher impulse of synthesis lying on the same axis of analogy in metaphysical space, but they cannot be the result of an internal rearrangement of the elements of this representation, according to the general principle of dynamics of the system, that the rearrangement of its elements cannot cause a change in the trajectory of the centre of gravity. In complete contrast, the system in the form of a binary in its own being contains both the possibility and the engine of its development. Each individual binary, carrying within himself the tendency to develop contradictions to the maximum, thereby outlines a certain potential direction in the metaphysical space. The further the binary moves in this direction, the higher its order will be, the more synthetic its members will be, and the more powerful the gravity between them will be. Sooner or later, this contradiction will reach a critical point in its development, after which the binary will either dissolve into another, or, on the contrary, attract a number of lower binaries. But in both cases it is the same. The axis of analogy, the potential direction of the binary, cannot be interrupted, and after crossing with another or other similar ones, continues further to the final synthesis. We have a quote here from Vladimir Solovyov. Everything has a place in the kingdom of God. Everything can be connected by an internal harmonious connection. Nothing should be suppressed and destroyed. Summarising the above, we can say that every binary revealed in the mind is in itself a natural pointer to the direction in which a person can strive to reach the corresponding edge of the universal synthesis. The totality of the representations of the mind is the totality of the binaries, and therefore the totality of the directions leading to this synthesis. The higher the plane of consciousness, the more the divergence of directions weakens. Individual binaries are reduced to finite ones, and in the end, the mind ends on the verge of world contradictions. The cognition of the deity through the development of binaries and their reduction into final world contradictions, which are the projection into the mind of individual aspects of the deity, passed through a number of religions and philosophical systems over the centuries, but this desire was especially strong amongst the Gnostic teachings. Most representatives of Gnosticism, starting with Simon Magus, Basilides, Valentine, and a number of others, built a cosmogony on the consistent identification of the incomprehensible absolute pairs of eons and archons. And this pair, the couple of eons, even bore the special name syzygy. In harmony with this, the deity itself was defined as a set of antinomies. According to the teaching of Dionysius the Areopagite, at the time when the human mind reaches the top of abstractions, when the mind gets rid of all sorts of ideas and images and is immersed in a mysterious silence, in a state of complete basin, in this moment, admiring the spirit of man, directly so to speak, feels deity. Outside of himself and everything around him, immersed in the mysterious darkness of ignorance, he is all in the one who is above all. Freeing himself from all knowledge, he unites his best side with the completely unknowable, knowing it beyond and beyond the natural actions of the mind. So divine darkness is also unapproachable light in which God himself dwells. Perfect ignorance of the conduct of him who is above every reference. God, according to Dionysius, simultaneously nameless and nogomerni, all and nothing, being and nothingness. From the simplest forms of thinking or feeling satisfy a person, when the simplest forms of thinking or feeling satisfy a person, not only can he not strive for higher ones, but he does not even suspect their existence. It is only when the finite becomes aware of its impotence, where it is already untenable, that the first glimpses of the eternal appear. As long as the mind is completely immersed in the realm of phenomenal nature, it lives and is satisfied with phenomenal laws and phenomenal life. It is only when the boundaries of the phenomenal world are reached that the mind begins to crave for the noumenal truth and noumenal laws, that the phenomenal nature ends at the edge of the world's antinomies. That is why the noumenal truth cannot be expressed in the mind except in antinomies. That was rather beautiful. The idea or law revealed in a binary is, in its inherent aspect, the absolute truth. A perfect synthesis of all a priori possible concrete representations cannot fail to have a biurnal transcription in the mind. The relative differs from the absolute in the presence of conditionality, conscious ignorance, conditional negation, and the assertion of a particular criterion. The relative is such insofar as it is unable to unite the contradictions that occur. The absolute is, first of all, the all-encompassing, the one-time affirmation and negation of all affirmations and all negations. Because of this, the truth in its perfect whole is expressed only in the perfect binary, as the totality of all a priori possible individual binaries. The lowest limit at which only the differential aspect of truth is projected in the mind is the single binary. So truth is expressed only in antinomies, and every antinomy is an aspect of truth. As Eliphas Levi said, binary is a unity divided by its own power to create. In his book Holy, Pavel Florensky wrote, "The unconditionality of truth from the formal side is expressed in the fact that it presupposes and accepts its negation and responds to doubts about its truth by accepting this doubt, and even in its limit. The truth is the truth because it is not afraid of any controversy, and is not afraid of them because it speaks against itself more than any denial can say. But this self-denial combines its truth with an affirmation. For the understanding, truth is a contradiction, and this contradiction is made manifest as soon as truth is verbally formulated. Each of the contradictory propositions is contained in the judgment of truth, and therefore the existence of each of them is provable with the same degree of persuasiveness, with necessity. Thesis and antithesis together form the expressions of truth. In other words, truth is an antinomy and cannot but be so. Coincidentia oppositorum is the goal of every philosophy, every thought, every search for the spirit, said one of the most brilliant thinkers, Giordano Bruno. Indeed, it is precisely in the destruction of contradictions, in the binding of them into a single whole, higher and giving rise to both extremes, that the goal of the true seeker lies. And in this very degree to which this is achieved, his development and the knowledge he has gained affect him. As Kuno Fischer wrote, the highest enlightenment should be able to explain everything. It should be comprehensive, the most universal education. The possession of this enlightenment is the true aristocracy of the spirit. Excuse me. In metaphysical space, a binary can be defined as follows. Binary is a system of two factors that are in a particular translational motion and are connected by the constancy of the differences of moments from any point. In mathematical terms, binary is a moment whose magnitude remains constant, while the magnitude of the forces of the pair can change arbitrarily, but all the time remaining inversely proportional to the shoulders. Forward motion is motion in a circle of infinitely greater radius. Therefore, we can say that every motion that we perceive in the world is the result of the action of one or a system of several vortices. The constancy of the magnitude of the moment when the absolute values of the forces of the pair change, and is a general principle from which a number of particular laws follow. So like a torsion field or a lemniscate. As thinking evolves, the difference between the thesis and the antithesis increases, but at the same time they come closer together. And at the moment when the difference becomes infinite, and this can only happen when the concept increases to the aspect of the deity, they merge and outline the divine essence in some particular section. The farther away the forces of the pair are, the more significant the speed of the vortex is. As the concept evolves, as its differences with the antipode increases, as the forces of the pair increase, the speed of the vortex increases due to a decrease in the area of its propagation. In the field of human thought, this law is reflected in the fact that undeveloped thoughts, concepts and images spreading throughout consciousness create a slow and weak movement. The shoulder of the pair is so large that the smallest external influence in the form of an active action on any member of the other pair can not only slow down the movement, but even disrupt it, giving an impetus to the opposite unnatural movement for this vortex. With the evolution of the concept, with an increase in its absolute magnitude, the shoulder decreases so much that a large influence from outside is needed to not only destroy, but to even change the existing movement. Such a vortex is already incomparably more stable. Just as the vast reserves of intraatomic energy cannot be used due to their own mutual neutralisation, so the human will is deprived of the opportunity to use the inexhaustible reserve of energy hidden in it. During the evolution of man, individual vortices cease to weaken each other. Each of them gets its own specific place in the human consciousness, and thus makes it possible for the will of man to orient the planes of moments with its power in one direction or another, to use their power to actively influence factors outside of it. The inaccessibility to the human consciousness of balancing the contradictions in all the objects under consideration, that is, neutralising the binaries, stems both from the complexity of their relationships and because different people have the ability to distinguish and identify to a very different degree. There is nothing indifferent in the world. Everything tends to each other. Everything is connected to each other. It is clear, says Carpenter, in his book Modern Science, that every object has some relation to every other object, and really exists only by virtue of its relation to other objects. All the phenomena of the universe are only the geometrical places of the points at which the lines of their mutual influences intersect. Every concept is known to us insofar as it is connected with those previously understood by us. No matter how simple the binary terms are, they nevertheless gravitate towards each other in different facets. Their relationship creates such a complex picture of mutual relations that it seems impossible to grasp in all its details, and without this it is impossible to correctly perceive this whole. Just as the first step to the creation of a science is the emergence of the ability to classify phenomena according to a properly developed scheme, so in this case, in order to neutralize any binary, a person must divide the concept he is considering into a number of consequences that follow from it, divide the phenomenon of nature into separate properties inherent in it. That's the discrimination. As soon as he can break the whole into parts, he will immediately see that the binary, which is so difficult to neutralize, is divided into a number of particular binaries, of which most, if not themselves, so to speak, beg for neutralization. Then, at any rate, can be brought to this state, if not directly, then through the introduction of new additional term. So I've been gardening my nails. The genesis of the binary principle and its various forms in the mind. And there's a quote here from the Taittiriya Upanishad. He thought, I can become a multitude and multiply. And he objectified himself and gave out of himself all that is. Having given all these things out of himself, he entered into it. And when he entered, he became everything, positive and negative, spirit and matter, infinite and finite. Each factor of the universe has a being in two aspects. First, in its own essence, and secondly, as a part of the universal whole. Knowing it through a series of successive oppositions, through a series of particular binaries, a person perceives it as something independently existing, that is, in the first aspect. Only when he brings this idea to its maximum, the second aspect will become available to him. The fact will lose its independence, and from the cause will become the effect. In harmony with this, the whole mass of private binaries, with the help of which a person approaches the knowledge of the factor, is thereby synthesized into one whole. The presence of these two aspects is the genesis of the binary principle. When the cognition of the factor has been completed in itself, that is, when the idea has developed to its maximum, it becomes an aspect of some higher synthesis which begins to act dynamically on it and immediately causes its negation to be. The latter is formulated by one of the basic laws of the theory of knowledge. Every representation or idea in its maximum contains its negation. So binary is born on the edge of a part, as part of the whole and a part in itself. From the above it is immediately clear that the birth of the first binary is the birth of the principle of particularity. May I be a plurality remaining one. That's from Brahman, 100 Paths, from the Chandogya Upanishad. The river of being, and by this act of his will, confirms the principle of binary and his purpose. Every particular is an affirmation of the synthesis in its corresponding aspect, and at the same time a negation of its synthesis in other aspects. This negation can only be formulated in the negation of the statement of a given particular. The negation of other statements in the aspect of a given particular is impossible because it does not contain the idea in itself. An example of this is the theory of Ptolemy and Copernicus. Taking the particular Earth as the centre, that is, considering the particular in the aspect of itself as such, Ptolemy was right in asserting the rotation of the Sun around it. Moving on to a higher synthesis, Copernicus put the Sun in the place of the Earth, and considering this particular in its aspect as such, he was right in saying that the Earth revolves around the Sun. At present, an even higher synthesis has become available to man. It is known that the Sun is moving towards the star of the constellation Hercules. Taking the latter as the centre, we see that the Earth is moving along a trajectory close to a sinusoid. From the above, it is clear that the principle of binary as such is an absolute principle, but every particular binary lies completely in the domain of the relative. The world of binaries is the world of the mind. for it is through the mind that affirmation and negation takes place, and therefore it is in the mind that binaries are born and neutralized in the mind. As Max Muller says, the English name of the understanding, intellect, expresses the interweaving of the general with the particular, which is a feature of the field of the mind. And as Stanley Jevons, who Shmakov quotes often here, says, science is in the mind, not in things, and the properties of the mind are thus most important. Each particular binary can be perceived differently by the human mind depending on the position of the plane of its perception in comparison with the studied factor. There are three possible cases. The first of them is when a person perceives the difference between two quantities of the same nature. In this case, he is in the most favourable conditions not only to compare two phenomena that are two stages of the same noumenon, but also to trace the intermediate stages of development of the difference between them, to catch causality and regularity. The second case is that when the quantities considered by him, although opposite in sign, are equal in magnitude. Here too, a person easily perceives the entire trajectory of the noumenon in its sequence and learns the laws governing it. Finally, the third case is that when the phenomena under consideration, being different in sign, have different magnitudes, having only a very different depth of thought, having only a very limited ability to adapt, the ordinary person, in most cases, is deprived of the opportunity to put his plane of perception in relation to the members of the binary, so as to perceive it in its pure form, that is, the form of a difference of equal and opposite magnitudes. And I had a picture to illustrate the whole thing. Which hopefully conveys the enormity of what we've just heard. And that's an artist's impression of the black hole studied by the astronomers using Ultracam attached to ESO's Very Large Telescope. So that was the High Priestess, the Arcanum of the Neutralisation of Binaries. Whew. This will be followed by Arcanum 3. You got it? The Empress, Divina Natura, Venus, Urania, Physis, Gimel 3, which we will look at next time because that was quite enough metaphysical, mind-blowing information, courtesy of Mr. Vladimir Shmakov.